Good day, everyone. I'm here today with Laurie Dennett, whose name probably should be very familiar to most Canadians as the first Canadian that I know of who walked the Camino in 1986 and wrote one book with two covers about it. I'm holding up the French picture because it's all green, whereas the Spanish picture is pretty sandy looking. But Laurie walked across France and Spain to arrive in Santiago in support of MS research. She came at a really important time in the Camino, and she has some wonderful observations to make about it. And if you want to have another rich treasure trove, this book, Waybread, is which we're going to be talking about. One of the chapters today are basically reflections and presentations that she's made about her time as a Camino aficionado, Camino supporter and promoter, and really a moving and driving force in many great initiatives. The albergue in Guaselmo and Rabanal, and support for the Camino as well. There's another confraternity albergue in Marath, and she was very much involved with that. I met Laurie in Toronto in 2005 when she was presenting at the joint gathering of the American Pilgrims on the Camino and the Canadian Company of Pilgrims. And it was great to have a Canadian presenting with such knowledge and background. So I'm just going to ask Laurie a few questions, and she's welcome to go in any direction she wishes to from that. And we hope you enjoy this conversation. Laurie, in your book Waybread, the most recent thing that you had done in time appeared in the first chapter. And why did you put the presentation, which was actually done in Toronto, in first place in the book?
Well, this yes, here's Waybread. The first chapter was a talk that I gave to the Canadian Company in November of 2018 when I just happened to be over here, and when I was trying to choose the items to go into Waybread, once I'd decided that it would be a good idea to produce this book at all, having read through all my own past essays and things during the pandemic, for want of anything better to do, I decided on putting this one first, and it wasn't an easy decision because there were a lot of pieces that I could have chosen but didn't. But I wanted something comprehensive both for me in that I could refer to it and it would cover my whole time of being associated with the Camino, and also a chunk of time that for my listeners in a restaurant out on Main Street here in Toronto, called El Camino, by the way. It was wonderful. It wouldn't be going too far back in time so that they had a great thread to follow. I really wanted to give them the past, 60 or 70 years since the war, say, since the Spanish Civil War. And it's a manageable chunk if you're talking to an audience whose knowledge you can't gauge because you've never met them before, and you don't really know whether they're going to know the names of medieval things or even be interested in that aspect, which of course was the aspect I was concentrating on in 2005 at the joint gathering, was the whole history of the whole thing, including the literary, in a sense, invention of the legend, how that all came into being, and how it was believed that the remains of St. James would be found where they in fact were found. That's all quite complicated stuff. And so I thought, well, I've put that essay in the book, but farther back. So this is not a chronological book at all. As you say, the most recent item, the latest in time, was the first in the book. But it was for that reason I felt it was the most comprehensive in the sense of being manageable and visible from the chairs people were sitting in, and it would give a good grounding for what came next, if that's a reasonable explanation.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Certainly, it does give us a really good look at the Camino, and I'm delighted to be talking about chapter 1 with you today. I shared with you that my first Camino was in 2005 as a winter Camino, in which I met very few other pilgrims, and there were sufficient lodgings. But I also often think that that winter Camino in that time, when people didn't have cell phones, and when we went back, um, uh, took us back to maybe earlier Caminos. Um, and many of us think about the way the Camino was when we first found it 20 years ago and beyond, and the way it exists today. What do you think are the major differences between then and now?
Oh, well, the obvious one, of course, is technology. Um, for better or worse, it certainly has some wonderful benefits, as we all know in our practical lives. It enables us to do things we used to take us much longer to do, or at least or we couldn't do at all. Um, but it also has its challenges. Not to be taken over by it. But back in 1986, of course, it didn't exist. So all of these, online fora, keeping in touch with home at the drop of a hat, doing what we're doing right now and talking to each other visually as well as just by voice, on the telephone. That was all in the future. And my great challenge then was to find a telephone on which to call Wally Crowder at CFRB in Toronto to give my bi-weekly report. And sometimes that was more of a challenge than actually walking from A to B, whatever my daily ration of kilometers was. Finding a working phone box, sometimes in the middle of nowhere, was quite difficult. And you rolled into a little place knowing perhaps that there was somewhere to stay there, but you perhaps didn't even have a phone number. You just had to go and bang on a door and ask if you could have a bed. And there were, another very remarkable observation, one could make is the plethora of places to stay nowadays, which makes it so much easier really for anyone to walk the Camino. You can be 80 years old, you can have need a hip replacement, you can be partially sighted, you can have small children in tow, and you can find places to stay within a distance that you can do without absolutely exhausting yourself. And back then, you really could not do that. The people who walked back then were people who were relatively young, and you got fitter as you went on because you had to. And you had to cover some amazing distances, which today would seem unthinkable, because there was no alternative unless you wanted to just doss down by the side of the road. There was simply nowhere to stay. And there was a very, very rudimentary network of municipal albergues, parish albergues. They weren't even called albergues then. They were just, 6 mattresses in a parish house, as in Carrion de los Condes, where the parish priest had cleared out his attic and made a little dorm for people up there. It was wonderful to come upon such places, but had there been 6 people in it already, I'm not sure what I'd have done, because I wasn't going to be able to go much farther the day that I got to Carrion de los Condes, because I'd just done 38 kilometers from Sagun. It was an absolute killer of a distance. And the day after that, I'd have been, heading for Mansilla de las Mulas at 39. One just had to do it, and you did it because you had to. But it was very, very demanding, and people were ruined for days after that. I certainly felt that for days. But today you don't have to do that. There are places anywhere, which means the wonderful thing of all the changes have brought is that many people can do the Camino that would have been totally put off just by common sense from doing it back in the 80s. So that's one big thing. The technology, of course, is another. And the provision of facilities for carrying luggage, the Guardia Civil giving you a hand if you need it, um, just the general attention to pilgrims was still very much in the future. Such attention as there was from individuals, not from, on the whole, associations, because most of them by then were barely getting off the ground. They might have existed, but they would be 6 or 7 people trying to make inroads in the community they were located in, and that was it. So it really was a mission field back then.
Yeah, thank you. The pilgrims in my first years as hospitalero almost 20 years ago would always be asking, where is the next albergue that is open? How far away is it? That kind of information. We might be looking at guidebooks, or we might be finding out from the local community about that. Now the question that they ask when they come in is, "I Wi-Fi? Is there a Wi-Fi so that they can get
That's right.
connected?" And they're using their devices to both research where it is, and then can they make a reservation? That seems to be a popular
Yes.
preoccupation.
Well, can I just spin on a moment and perhaps touch upon something you indicated you did want to speak about anyway? This is perhaps a good place to do that. When one made inquiries, and it was always back then in '86, through either the confraternity or the Société des Amis in Paris. And in my case, it was both. I inquired to one and got handed on to the other. And the advice and information one was given related to individuals, not to associations or even to places, but to individuals. And so Mademoiselle Varcollier in Paris put me in touch with a whole list of people, or she at least told me who to watch out for or who to ask for if I arrived in a place, and someone didn't immediately say to me, "Oh, you need to find so and so," I should ask for that person. So if I got to Villa Sirga, I should ask for Pablo Payo. Well, in the end, I didn't have to, because Pablo Payo found me. But he used to position himself in a bar at the time of day that he knew pilgrims would arrive, having walked from wherever that they would pass through at that time, and he would dash out of the bar and clutch them by the arm and say, "Peregrino or Peregrina," and insist on buying you a coffee and hearing where you came from and where were you going to stay. And if you didn't have somewhere to stay, well, then he would find you somewhere. And it was all very much on a personal basis. So I knew that I would meet certain people, but there were great distances between them. And you kind of, tossed your hat forward to the next hook as you walked along, and thought, well, that'll be wonderful to be able to talk about things with X or Y. But it was a question of finding them. So Mademoiselle Varcollier in Paris was the fount of all knowledge back then. And she would send you a mimeographed sheet of paper, on both sides with this list of people. And you just hoped that you'd, encounter them, really, and you made efforts to. So the next person that she would pass one on to, she would pass me on to, was Madame de Brûle in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, which is a long way. I mean, it's the length of France, and I had a lot of ground to cover before I got that far. But in the end, I had the great good fortune to meet, purely by chance, Monsieur le Marquis de la Cosme-Meselier, who was the president of the Société des Amis. Then Mademoiselle was the secretary, and I met him purely because I took my courage in both hands, coming out of a church in a place where I noticed on the bulletin board a little card with a phone number on it. And this was something that had been put up months before on the off chance that another pilgrim would pass by and see it. And he'd written his phone number there, and it was just signed, M. de Lacoste. And I had no idea that this was going to be Monsieur de Lacoste Meselier. So I rang this number, and of course it was he, and he said, well, I'll come and meet you tomorrow, which he did. On his way to Paris. He screeched to a halt on the open road, and we stood there for the better part of an hour in the rain, and had a great talk. And he gave me more names of people to contact and so on. I also then had the good fortune to be contacted via the Canadian Embassy, who had been rung up by Odile Loutard just outside Bordeaux. And she'd seen the article in Sud-Ouest written by one of the journalists who'd gone to the reception in London. So this was, she was ringing to say, I would love to put this pilgrim up, whoever she is, whenever she passes, please get her to get in touch with me. So I did. And that was how I was very kindly received by Odile Loutard, who was just at that point trying to get a little association started in Aquitaine. She lived in Gradignan on the south side of Bordeaux, and there was an old priory there dedicated to St. James, where pilgrims had been passing in the Middle Ages, and she took me to see that. So the whole thing began to take some physical shape, with the monuments of the route coming to life, the various churches and cathedrals where I knew that pilgrims had passed. There was a place also where pilgrims, there'd been an albergue in one of the monasteries, and pilgrims had sat there and carved their graffiti while waiting to go in. And, I was taken to see that, and, told the history of that. So it all began to come together. In San John d'Angeli, there was a priory also very much linked to the pilgrimage, because of Aymeric Picot came from one of the institutions very near there. So by the time I got down into very near the Pyrenees, it was beginning to actually acquire some shape and focus. And I met Dr. Clement Uribetti, wonderful Basque historian, who took me up and showed me in the distance where the three roads came together, and drove me up to see the stone that marked the spot. We had to drive some pigs away, for they were all around it, eating the grass around it, and he flapped his hat at them, and off they went, so I could get a photograph of it. I think there's the back of a pig in one of them. But he was a wonderful historian, and there is now in that place, Saint-Palais, the Museum of the Caminos, which is really his collection left to the municipality, which they had the good sense and the funds to make something of. So that's there to be visited today. But then, of course, the next stop was Madame de Bril in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, who was a wonderful character and gave me my credencial. And that I carried with me and got stamped all the way. She put the first stamp in it. And she was a great figurehead in that part of the world and in the French Caminos for many, many years. She'd been helping pilgrims for a long time, putting them up in her home and so on. So it was a great privilege to meet her. And from then on, I met a number of people. I met Padre Navarro in Roncesvalles, who had been doing some waymarking around the monastery to help pilgrims find it. And then from there in Estella, I met Francisco Berjuete, who was the founder of the very first Spanish association in Estella. They were really a historical association, more interested in the immediate area, but also in the Camino. And they had produced a guide, a huge 2-volume guide, even before Don Elias did. And, so there were people, I would stress, working on the Camino, but not, the dots weren't joined up yet. They were working in rather isolated little nuclei. And when I said before we started that I felt I was very lucky to go to walk in 1986, it was because a year earlier, those nascent groups, which Don Elias had put one in touch with another, they all met in Santiago and made him the coordinator for the future development of the Camino. And it was just beginning in that year, 1986, 85, 86, you were beginning to be able to trace the thread right across Spain, and they all did at least know one another by then, which hitherto they had not. So I met, after Francisco Berguete, I met Don Jose Maria Alonso in San Juan de Ortega, and that was a wonderful experience to be welcomed as a pilgrim by him and sat down with 3 or 4 other pilgrims traveling by different means. There was one guy who was a cyclist, somebody else working on his doctorate on the Templars, traveling in a van and camping all the way, etc. But he sat the 3 of us down together and we had a chat, and they were not quite the first pilgrims I'd met. I met a Dutchman in Saint Jean Piet, but you got the first inklings of the traditional pilgrim hospitality, to be sat down at a table with others and served up with some bread soup or garlic soup and conversed with by an open fire for long into the night, which was, then you went up to the freezing dormitory and got what sleep you could. But it was just a lovely experience and very inspiring. And then, you went on to Burgos, and you were on your own again, or I was, and, all that across the Meseta. I was on my own until I met my 2 first Spanish pilgrims on the way out of Castellariz, and didn't see them again for days. But then eventually we crossed paths again in Carrion de los Condes and walked out to Villasirca together, because dear Pablo Payo had invited us all to go and have a meal at his maison. So we did that, and that was how I found anyone to walk with back then. And I carried on and walked with them the rest of the way to Santiago. Most of the time I walked with one of them in particular. The other one was very much, of his own mind. But and then of course when I got to O Cebreiro, I met Don Elias for the first time, and again, there were a number of us sitting at a table in the dining room, and he came and did his round of the room and heard from each of us where we were from and how we were finding it. And he was very concerned that we had found places to stay and had found people helpful, and so on and so on. And you got the sense of someone absolutely trying to make this experience live for us all. I don't want to miss out somebody very special, and that was Tronina in Rabanal, whose family had been putting pilgrims up for generations. And I met her, and she later became the key holder of the building that became Refugio Gaucelmo. I met Jesus Hato in Villafranca del Bierzo, whose family similarly, he grew up with a grandmother who took pilgrims in all the time. So there were these people on the Camino who looked out for pilgrims if they came across them. And in those days they usually did, and just offered them somewhere, barn or hayloft or spare bedroom or whatever it happened to be, to lay their heads on a meal. And it was so much appreciated, and certainly ignited that wonderful sense of gratitude that never really goes out, does it? So there we are. wonderful people.
Wonderful, Laurie. Thank you for that. You also write about the early associations, and he just referred to it on the tangent. And I know that you've been able to go to many of the congressos that those associations have attended over the years. You recently were in Santiago in October for the most recent one. We had a couple of Canadian representatives there as well. How are things developing, do you think, with the support of the international pilgrim associations?
Well, the whole thing has become absolutely immense beyond any imaginings that I had even had. I mean, I knew that there were associations of all kinds on the other sides of the world, you know, all around the world, but I had no idea how fast things have moved. For instance, in South America, where you know, I knew about the States and Canada. I didn't know about Mexico, but neither did I know about Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Brazil, the Brazilian Association. I did know, but you know, Colombia. There were people from each and every one of those associations there to speak, and what they are doing are creating walking routes in their countries, which are, I mean, obviously they're not caminos in the historic sense, but the purpose of them is to evoke the spirit of the Camino for people from those countries who have walked or cycled, whatever, in Spain or France, and keep the kind of momentum going when they get home, because they're looking around for things to do, and they're, as you will know, wonderful fundraisers, because they do very much keep the spirit alive, and so all these new people were there. Again, technology has a really important part to play in that, and so does European community money, which allows the junta to be as generous as it is in funding a lot of these initiatives. So things are advancing by leaps and bounds, and it was very interesting to hear from some of these clutches of countries, you know, from far-flung continents where I, for one, had not been aware that there were as much going on as there is. I mean, Chile shared the Elias Valinia Prize last year for various initiatives that it has mounted, but you know, mainly for supporting initiatives in Spain, I think. But it's just interesting to know that they're out there, and in the Far East as well. We had somebody from Taiwan, we had somebody from Hong Kong, you know, and the Japan, of course, has been big for a long time. So has Korea been big for a long time. But you know, in Southeast Asia is coming up fast, and I don't know quite how that's going to evolve, but it's interesting to know that there are people out there. So, and there seems, what I detect, you ask about that, about institutions. What I detect is the sudden recent impulse towards federating. You know, we now look as though we're going to have a European federation on top of a Spanish federation and a French federation, plus all the individual countries with their federations. It looks as though there is going to come into being a European one. There may well be a federation of the Americas in the future, you know, bringing together North America, South America, etc. So you may find yourselves subsumed in something like that. Quite what that's going to mean in terms of funding and structure and bureaucracy, I do not know. And I don't really have a view in it, because I'm not in at that level, nor do I wish to be. But I think that may be what's coming down the pipeline, put it that way.
Thank you. In the first chapter, you're also talking about the impetus to give back, and this impetus kind of was the genesis of the Donativo albergue system. Of
Mhm.
course, your connection with Don Elias Avelina San Pedro gave an opportunity to see that from very much the inside. Where do you see this going? Where do you see the Donativos succeeding, and where are maybe some of their weaknesses or areas that they're going to have to worry about?
Well, I was very worried about them. Uh, the other side of the pandemic. I think, on a positive note, the two associations, the Albergues de Acogida Tradicional, which is a grouping of donativos albergues. There are 16 or 17 of them, uh, all from the Pyrenees, on the Spanish side of the Pyrenees, um, and the FIX, the Fraternidad Internacional del Camino de Santiago, which takes its impetus from the spirit as they see it of Don Elias. They've got together and managed, I think, in Castilla and Leon to beat off some of the rather resentful attempts to create legislation against donativos. There was an initiative of that nature, I'm sorry to say, back on the other side of the pandemic, on the part of albergues that felt that private ones, people who were running them as businesses. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but they I think completely lost the plot in claiming that Donativo albergues were unfair competition. Well, they don't know their Camino history. That is all I can say about that. But anyway, that I think has been put in its place. So we've got nothing against private albergues. They do a tremendous amount of good, and many of them are started up by people who've been pilgrims themselves and so on. But there are no guarantees in running a business. When you set up a business, it doesn't mean that the world suddenly has to fall into step with you, and you take your chances. And such competition as there is, you take it in stride. And if the competition comes with 1,000-year history behind it, and the spirit of the Camino as the impulse for it, I think it's it's a hard act to follow. You do as best you can, but you can't expect it to just disappear or roll over and play dead. So, but the FIX and the Albergues de Acogida Tradicional have succeeded in getting, I believe, succeeded in getting the opposition in Castilla and Leon to recognize more or less what I've just said, but also to accept the intangible social good, which is the traditional Camino hospitality, as something that is part of the patrimony of humanity. And so it's been declared part of the intangible patrimony of humanity. So attempts to sideswipe it of the nature that I've just described, I think, have been forced to back off in the face of that. It may exist in individual places, but I think there's been a sense of proportion put into things. So I'm not as concerned about that in the general sense anymore. I am in particular places because in particular places where nobody looks very hard and perhaps people don't know any better, there are kind of tacit agreements that put the Albergues de Donativo at a disadvantage. And they do it with the collaboration of various forces. I don't want to go into that too much, but I do know about arrangements whereby in some places the municipal albergue doesn't open until all the private ones are full, which I consider scandalous, but nonetheless, I know they exist. And I'm not going to name them either, but I know they exist. And pilgrims need to be aware of that, perhaps, and simply go and park themselves outside the municipal one, because eventually it will open. It just won't be open at 1 o'clock. So if people want to stay in it for a minimum cost, they just have to persevere or be Waybread, just resist the pressures to to do other than that. Anyhow, and you do get uh, instances of uh, private albergues perhaps behaving in ways that they shouldn't, like going down the Camino and soliciting pilgrims on their way to X or Y, or spreading false rumors miles ahead that the municipal is terrible, or that it's closed, or that the hospitalero is a brute, or something like that, so as to swing people, into their own doorway. And it's not very nice. So let's leave it at that. But it does happen. But on the whole, people coexist pretty well. So as we all know.
There are lots of pilgrims to go around in these days as well.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Um, so I'm less concerned about the albergues de donativo than I used to. If anything, we in Galthelmo, and I think I could speak for Marath as well, we feel that the pilgrims who go there because they genuinely want to. They've either heard about it or they wouldn't be candidates for a private facility anyway. They like the historical resonance and the tradition and being able to connect with people, which we offer through the various things we do, like tea and the communal breakfast and all of that. And so they're there because they want to be. And I think I'm still on that committee, the Ravenel committee. The feedback we get is really excellent. And I think people appreciate our hospitaleros, or you would know a number of them, as I do. They're just really put so much of themselves into it, and that comes across. So pretty wonderful to be even associated with that, and to see it thriving is just a joy.
Something to share with you. Working in Gragnon a couple of times, we had certain nationalities that were showing up outside of what you'd expect their proportion on the Camino was. So I've asked them, I said, how can we have so many Danish pilgrims, or how can we have so many Korean pilgrims? And the answer I got back was, we are here because our guidebook told us that we must stop and stay here. So
Yes, yes,
that traditional welcome, as is in Guaselmo and as in some of the other donativos, is seen and appreciated. And I think you often get people who are staying there by intent, and that's a wonderful thing. I mean, it's great to take anybody in who comes to the door, but to have people who are there because they've chosen you is gratifying.
yes, and people who walk absolutely with their hearts set on staying. And occasionally we get somebody who has had their heart on staying, and the place is full, and it's they'll happily go and sleep in the huerta, rather than move on. But anyway, it's yes, the point taken.
I would share with you that recently, because pilgrims are now more and more expecting to make a booking ahead of time, that often the phone will ring in some of the donativos and they'll ask, "Are you open?" And we'll say, "Yes." "Can I make a reservation?" And we say, "No." You come and the numbers in some of the donativos actually are below what you would expect, just because the pilgrims are expecting to have to make a reservation, and that the donativos run counter to that. So they're still existing. There's still lots of money to support them, but they're not getting the pressure that the increased numbers of pilgrims might predict you'd get on them.
Yes, well, that unfortunately is yet another bit of false info that gets spread around, a day or two in advance. Oh, well, if you haven't got a reservation, there won't be a place for you. You might as well come to X or Y. Here I am. I'll take your booking. This sort of thing. I had a very heartfelt conversation with the hospitaleros of the German albergue in La Faba, which is Donativo albergue, and they felt that they were being, you know, denied pilgrims because of false information being spread in the days anterior to pilgrims arriving. People were being told that their place was closed, or that there was nobody there to look after them, or whatever. And pilgrims were, and some of them were unaware that La Faba even existed. And they said, what can we do about that? And I said, well, the first thing I will do is phone Galfelmo and get our hospitaleros to tell pilgrims that you are open, period. Don't don't listen to any nonsense as you approach, as they approach the crucial climb, So
in 2009, I was in Fontebedon near the Cross of Iron, and the private albergue had opened. I was there in 2006, and I was the only game in town, so there were no problems that way. But in 2009, we heard that pilgrims told us that the people below had told them that our albergue was closed, or that it had no heat, or that it was full, which were all untrue. We went below town and put up a sign and said, "Domesday está abierto con calefacción. Estamos disponible. Un donativo, bienvenidos." And we were basically trying to counteract this negative. And I understood why it was happening, because that family who were in that albergue could get 22 euros from the pilgrims for a dinner and a breakfast and a stay, and ours was donativo. So they saw us as a competition that was either unfair or going to take money out of their treasury. Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about you live beside the Camino, and you talk about years when you would only see maybe a dozen pilgrims going through, whereas now you might see 50. And I had an experience in O Cebreiro that I treasure. In 2006, we went into the bar at Kelta, and it was a Saturday night, and the local men started to arrive, and they brought in their gaitas and their tambores, their drums and their bagpipes. And they started an impromptu concert and just passed the gaita around back and forth. And my friend Rosa got up and started dancing. We joked she walked 30 kilometers and danced for 5 more that night. But that look into, or that element of local culture and tradition and pride, is something that often the pilgrims don't get to see, because they're obsessed with getting down early so they can get up early so they can get to the next albergue. Do you have advice or suggestions for how maybe people can be a little more aware of the local culture? Because there's a rich culture along the Camino that in many cases the pilgrims just aren't on the right schedule to partake of.
Well, that's a tricky one. It's a constant tricky one, really. I know the man who owns the Venta Celta, and he is a great aficionado of music of every kind, and he will declaim Latin to you at the drop of a hat. He's quite wonderful. Jose Maria Nunez is his name, and they will have been, the men you encountered would have been buddies of his from the villages roundabout, and he'll have organized something that night. But yes, it is great when that happens. And I think how you can connect with that, well, you just have to be in the right place at the right time. I mean, in Galicia, a lot of people have a gaita hanging on the back of a door somewhere, and if you said, I'm really interested in hearing the gaita, he might even go and get it and play something for you. They'd be thrilled. But otherwise, I think it's just luck. And the pilgrims who do go to bed early, of course, would not have rejoiced as you did in that extempore concert going on below them, because they've probably been trying to sleep. We have that in the Hotel O Cebreiro up the hill all the time. Pilgrims who are sleeping upstairs, very aware of what's going on in the bar downstairs, and the bar owners will say, "Okay, look, it's 9:30. That's it. That's So it's a tricky one. I don't know how you connect more. I think probably just ask if anybody plays the pandereta or has one that you could look at, or if there's a gaitero locally that might you could ask to come in and maybe pass the hat for him afterwards. I don't know, but that's just what occurs to me. But it is wonderful when that happens. It is just a joy. So you do, and you get that.
Thanks for that.
You get that in the albergues anyway. You get pilgrims traveling with a musical instrument. We're always hearing from Gauthelmo that someone has traveling with a flute, or has used the resident guitar to give an extempore concert to people, or someone's a singer and they gather people around to entertain afterwards. We've had magicians and all manner of wonderful people going along. So yeah, it just worth asking, I would say.
That's a good suggestion. As hospitalero, I always put music into the meal when we have a meal together. At the close of the meal, I will say, we have a saying in English, "Sing for your supper." So I want you to sing with me. And so I will start off and I will use Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah because
Oh
everybody
yeah,
knows that song. And I
yeah,
will invite them to be singing the chorus with me and put the chorus in right in the middle of the verses so that there's more opportunities for repetition. And then
yeah,
after we're finished, I proudly say, "That is a song from my country, from Canada. Do you
yeah,
have a song from your country?" We warn them coming in that it's a musical albergue, so people have brought their phones with when that's one of the advantages of the technology, with their
yes,
words, and sometimes we get 6 and 8 different languages around the table, and it makes for a magical evening for people. Just
yeah,
one other contribution on my part. I worked in Nájera a few times, and I worked at the time when they had the El Festivo de Santa Gertrudis, the 15th and the 16th of November. They have this festival for a German pastoral saint, and the pilgrims would be recruited to put on costumes and wear the large paper mache heads, the cabezudos, and we would
yeah,
walk in the parade with the locals with their pipes and drums and fireworks and giving out candies, caramelos, to the
yes.
children, and then invited back to the house of Jose Luis and Begonia for a Spanish dinner. And
Oh,
again,
lovely.
another wonderful night for the pilgrims on the Camino, something that they don't typically get to see.
That's terrific. That's terrific,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Laurie, thank you so much for this conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I'm going to stop the recording.
Oh, thank you for having
Oh,
me.
just let me say one more thing, though. I mentioned that I had met Laurie at the joint gathering of the Canadian Company of Pilgrims in Toronto in 2005 at St. Michael's College in May. And Laurie's been invited to present again in 2025 in Vancouver, when we're again going to have a joint conference between the American Pilgrims and the Canadian Company of Pilgrims. And I look forward to seeing you there and enjoying that time together. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm honored. Thanks very much.